The morning sun filtered through the tall oaks that lined our quiet suburban street, casting golden patterns across our driveway. Birds chirped from rooftops, sprinklers whispered in nearby lawns, and the scent of freshly mowed grass drifted through the open window. On the surface, it was a peaceful place, the kind of neighborhood real estate agents advertise as safe, serene, and community-oriented. For me, it was a retreat, a calm corner of the world where I could raise my daughter away from the chaos of city life and my own demanding role in law enforcement. My name isn't important yet. Most of the neighbors just called me Emily's dad. That suited me just fine. Emily, my 13-year-old daughter, was the light of my life. Born with cerebral palsy, she had spent much of her young life navigating hospitals, therapists, and endless assessments. But despite it all, her spirit was vibrant, resilient in ways that most adults couldn't comprehend. Her laugh could turn a bad day around in an instant, and her quiet courage reminded me daily of what true strength looked like. We moved into this neighborhood 3 years ago, drawn by the accessibility of the home and the promise of a tight-knit community. Emily loved it here at first. She took particular joy in tending to the little garden by our porch. Pansies, tulips, and lavender, all carefully chosen for their colors and scents. She couldn't run or play like the other kids, but she found freedom in the soil, in nurturing something with her own hands. The Homeowners Association, or HOA as everyone called it, was always a presence, hovering over every shrub and paint color. I didn't think much of it at first. Rules were rules. I'd spent my whole career enforcing them. But it didn't take long to notice the undercurrent. One particular member who seemed to police not just property lines, but people. Her name was Karen. Blonde bob, sharp tongue, always clutching a clipboard like it was a weapon. The kind of person who smiled at you while writing a complaint. Still, in those early days, I thought we could coexist. I thought reason and kindness would be enough. I had no idea how wrong I was. It started small, almost laughably so. A note left under our door one morning, folded neatly in a plastic sleeve to protect it from the dew. Please ensure the flower pots are placed symmetrically on the porch. It affects visual harmony. No signature, just the HOA emblem stamped in the corner. I smiled at the absurdity of it, thinking it must be some general notice sent to everyone. But when I glanced at the neighboring homes, pots tilted, decorations varied, I realized it had been meant for us. Or more precisely, for Emily. She had arranged the pots herself the day before. One was slightly off-center, leaning toward the sun. It was her way of expressing independence, her creativity blooming alongside those pansies and marigolds. I adjusted nothing, but the following day, a second notice arrived. This time, it addressed the ramp leading to our front door, calling it visually disruptive and not in compliance with community aesthetic guidelines. My jaw tightened. That ramp was the only way Emily could enter and leave our home without being carried. It had passed every safety and building code inspection. The only thing it didn't pass was Karen's personal taste. Over the next few weeks, the pattern became undeniable. We'd find her parked across the street, sitting in her SUV, staring at our house like she was watching a security feed. Sometimes she walked her dog past our lawn 3 or 4 times a day, eyes locked on Emily as if cataloguing offenses. A decorative wind chime, too loud. A handmade welcome sign, too childish. Every tiny expression of Emily's joy became a target. I tried reasoning with her once, politely asking if there was a problem we could address together. She smiled that rehearsed, thin-lipped smile and said, "We just want to maintain standards, don't we?" before walking off. Emily had overheard the conversation and asked that night if her garden was ugly. I reassured her, but the hurt lingered behind her eyes. I could see her confidence beginning to shrink. There was something in Karen's eyes, something controlling, possessive. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was about power. And she had decided that we didn't belong. One evening, I caught her standing across the street with her phone angled toward our house, snapping pictures like some undercover agent on a mission. She didn't flinch when I stepped onto the porch. She didn't even pretend to hide it. Just tilted her head slightly and smiled, as if daring me to say something. Emily was inside, humming to herself while watering her herbs, basil, mint, and a single strawberry plant she'd named Rosie. I stood there, arms crossed, watching Karen retreat down the sidewalk with the same self-satisfied air she always carried. The photos kept coming. Sometimes we'd receive printed images attached to fresh HOA notices, circled in red ink like crime scene evidence. One showed Emily's wheelchair parked too far left on the ramp. Another featured her raised planter box, labelled as unsightly and non-compliant. They were grasping at straws. And yet, the messages always bore the authority of the association, signed by Karen, who had somehow made herself chair of every committee that mattered. Then came the flowers, or rather, what happened to them. I woke up one morning to find half of Emily's garden wilted, the leaves shriveled and spotted. A quiet panic took over her as she tried watering them, thinking maybe it was her fault. But I'd seen enough in my time to know the signs. Someone had poisoned them. Maybe bleach. Maybe something worse. No witnesses, no cameras, just suspicion and silence. Emily didn't say much that day. She sat on the edge of the porch, shoulders hunched, hands limp in her lap. Her eyes didn't wander like they used to. They stared at the soil, as if trying to will something good back into it. Later that night, she asked me in the quietest voice I've ever heard if people thought she didn't belong here. If her chair, her garden, her laughter made others uncomfortable. If she was the reason everything felt so heavy. I knelt beside her, holding her hand, swearing it wasn't her, swearing it was them. But inside, something burned. Not just anger. Something deeper. A warning bell. Karen wasn't just petty. She was dangerous. And she was only getting bolder. It was a warm afternoon, the kind where sunlight draped everything in gold, and the air smelled faintly of honeysuckle. Emily had rolled herself down the walkway, with her gardening gloves tucked into her lap, excited to show me the tiny green buds poking through the soil in her favourite planter. She had asked if she could wheel across the community lawn to get a better view of the nearby butterfly bush. I had nodded, distracted by a work call, thinking nothing of it. She wasn't hurting anyone, just admiring nature. But to Karen, that simple act was a violation of everything she thought she controlled. I didn't see the beginning, but I heard it. The sharp pitch of Karen's voice rising across the lawn, slicing through the calm like a siren. I rushed outside to see her standing just feet from Emily, flailing her arms and shouting about trespassing, about rules and respect and how we were spoiling the neighborhood. Emily looked stunned, clutching the wheels of her chair, unable to retreat. Karen stepped closer, her tone more venomous with each word. Then, in one horrifying second, she reached out and shoved the armrest of Emily's chair. The wheelchair tilted. Emily screamed. The sound was short and sharp, like something breaking. I sprinted across the grass, heart pounding, phone falling from my hand mid-call. By the time I reached her, she was lying on her side in the grass, the wheelchair upended, her hands scraped, her ankle twisted beneath her. Karen was already backing away, hands raised in mock innocence, eyes darting around as a few neighbors began to peek from behind curtains and porches. "She came at me!" Karen yelled. "She rolled right at me! I panicked!" I didn't touch her. I dropped to my knees and scooped Emily into my arms, shielding her from the stairs. I called 911. When the police arrived, Karen played the role of the frightened citizen to perfection. No witnesses would speak. No cameras had caught it. Emily was left bruised, both inside and out. They didn't arrest her, just took statements and left. Emily's voice trembled all night. I sat beside her bed, jaw clenched, fury and helplessness burning in my chest. Something had changed. Karen had crossed a line, and I would never let her near my daughter again. It had been just over a week since Karen tipped Emily's chair and walked away without consequence. The bruises were fading, but the memory clung to her like a shadow. Emily had grown quieter, more cautious, yet she insisted on tending to her flowers again. I watched her from the window that morning, gently misting the new shoots with a spray bottle, the sleeves of her hoodie covering the scars on her arms. Her face was calm, focused. For a moment, it felt like things were returning to normal. I almost believed we'd found peace again. Then I saw her, Karen. She marched across the sidewalk with her phone in one hand and something else clutched tightly in the other. A gardening trowel, long and metallic, the kind meant for digging into hard earth. I was already halfway to the door when I heard her voice, shrill and laced with fury. She was yelling about an unauthorized potted plant that Emily had placed near the mailbox. Emily tried to explain that it was just a gift for a neighbor, something small and cheerful, but Karen wasn't listening. She never listened. The shouting intensified. I broke into a run. Karen was inches from my daughter now, pointing the trowel like a weapon, spit flying from her lips as she barked about bylaws and property values, and how people like you ruin communities. Emily turned to wheel away, but Karen lunged forward. In one violent, unthinking motion, she swung the trowel downward, and it sank into Emily's leg. Emily screamed. The world blurred. I was there in seconds, yanking Karen back with a force I didn't know I had, my arms around my daughter as she writhed in pain, blood staining the fabric of her pants. Neighbors rushed out at last, drawn by the scream that split the quiet afternoon in half. Someone called an ambulance, someone else called the police. Karen stood off to the side, still clutching the trowel, insisting she'd been threatened, that it was self-defense, that Emily had startled her. I didn't say a word. I sat in the grass, holding Emily as she cried into my chest, the sirens finally drawing closer. That was the moment everything inside me hardened. Karen thought she'd gotten away with everything. She had no idea who I really was. But she would. The hospital room was sterile and quiet, save for the soft beep of the monitors and the occasional murmur from the nurses in the hallway. Emily lay in bed, pale but stable, her leg bandaged tightly and elevated on a foam wedge. She had been brave through the pain, through the questions, through the endless poking and prodding. But now, with the morphine dulling her discomfort, she slept. Peaceful, unaware of the storm gathering just outside those walls. I stood by the window, hands clenched behind my back, my reflection cast in the glass like a ghost of someone I used to be. For too long, I'd kept that part of myself buried here. I'd wanted to be just a father, not a badge, not a title. But the line had been crossed. This wasn't about codes or bylaws anymore. This was violence. This was my daughter. I pulled out my phone and began making calls. Not to the local precinct, but to my own office. Contacts I hadn't reached in months. I used names that carried weight, codes that moved faster than red tape. Within an hour, I had the HOA's full roster in front of me, including Karen's file. There it was. A history of complaints, buried infractions, and a trail of fear she'd left among the residents, many too afraid to speak up. Not anymore. When the officers came to take Emily's statement, I met them in the hallway and handed them my credentials. Deputy Commissioner, statewide jurisdiction. Their eyes widened. One of them stepped back. The other muttered an apology. I told them I wasn't here for respect. I was here for justice. The next day, I held a press briefing outside the hospital. Not in uniform, but with full authority. I spoke not just as an officer, but as a father. I described what had happened to Emily in measured, careful words. I called for an immediate investigation into the HOA. I demanded accountability. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled, and Karen, wherever she was hiding, could no longer pretend this was just another complaint she could bury. She hadn't just picked the wrong fight. She had stabbed the wrong child. By the end of the week, subpoenas were in motion, and investigators were walking door to door with notebooks and body cams. I didn't oversee the case directly, conflict of interest, but I knew the team they assigned. Sharp, no-nonsense professionals who didn't care for HOA politics or suburban posturing. They started with Karen, of course, who had gone from smug and self-righteous to panicked and reclusive in a matter of days. Her once daily strolls stopped. Her curtains remained closed. She didn't answer the door when officers knocked. But the paper trail didn't need her permission. What they uncovered was worse than I imagined. Karen had weaponized her HOA authority for years. Dozens of complaints filed against families, mostly those with disabled members, renters, or anyone who didn't fit her narrow view of community standards. She had bypassed proper votes, manipulated board meetings, even intimidated newer residents into silence. There were warnings from past board members buried in meeting minutes, notes scribbled in margins about her aggressive approach and tendency to escalate minor disputes. Most disturbing were the off-the-record accounts. Neighbors who now stepped forward, emboldened by the investigation, telling stories of quiet harassment and thinly veiled threats. One elderly couple recounted how she had forced them to remove a porch swing their grandson had built for them, claiming it was an eyesore. Another mother said Karen called Child Protective Services on her because her autistic son played too loudly in the backyard. And now, after years of unchecked cruelty, she had turned physical, driving a garden tool into a disabled child's leg over a potted plant. The local news ran the story daily. Images of Emily's wheelchair tipped in the grass, a clip of me calling for legal reform, and better safeguards against HOA overreach. Karen's name became synonymous with everything wrong about unchecked power in suburban communities. She couldn't hide anymore. When the police reclassified the incident as felony assault, the arrest came swiftly. She was taken from her home in handcuffs, surrounded by flashing lights and hushed gasps from neighbors peeking through blinds. Her face, once so confident and controlling, was pale and tight with disbelief. The reign of Karen had ended, but the fight for justice had only just begun. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Not the air, but the feeling. Sterile, detached, like the space itself refused to acknowledge the emotions that had brought us there. Karen sat at the defendant's table in a navy blazer, her hair tied back tight, lips pursed like she still thought this was some neighborhood dispute that had spiraled too far. But the charges were clear now: felony assault with a weapon, aggravated battery against a disabled minor, and abuse of authority in a community role. She didn't look so confident anymore. Emily was beside me, hands folded in her lap, dressed in soft blue. Her wheelchair gleamed from the polish we'd given it the night before. She was nervous, but steady. When called to testify, she wheeled herself to the stand with a quiet dignity that silenced the entire room. She spoke softly but with clarity, recounting the day she was stabbed, how Karen had screamed at her, how the trowel had cut through her leg like fire. When she paused to steady her breath, the judge waited. When she looked at Karen and said, "I don't know why you hated me," even the court reporter stopped typing for a moment. The defense tried their tricks, claimed Karen had been under stress, that she'd felt threatened, that the trowel was never meant to harm. But video clips from neighbors, emails she had written, and the sheer volume of documented complaints stripped away every excuse. Her history betrayed her. This wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was a pattern. I took the stand next, this time in uniform. I spoke not as an officer, but as a father who had watched his daughter live in fear. I detailed the harassment, The night she cried, asking if she was the problem. The moment I saw her bleeding in the grass. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth carried its own weight. The jury didn't take long. Guilty on all counts. The judge called Karen's actions calculated, cruel, and cowardly. She was sentenced to 7 years, with no chance of parole for the first 4. When they took her away, she didn't look at anyone. But Emily looked straight ahead, chin high, unblinking. Justice had been served. The neighborhood felt different after the trial, as if a weight had lifted from the air. Lawns looked greener, doors stayed open longer, and people who once hurried past with downcast eyes now paused to say hello. Karen's house remained empty, a hollow shell of what it once represented. The shutters closed tight like a bad memory everyone was trying to forget. But it wasn't about her anymore. It was about what came next. The HOA underwent a complete overhaul. A new board was elected, this time by actual vote, not by intimidation. Residents showed up in record numbers, eager to reclaim their community. Rules were rewritten, and oversight committees were formed to ensure no one would ever again hold unchecked power over their neighbors. I kept my distance, offering quiet support, but letting the people lead. This was their victory too. Emily's recovery was slow, but steady. The physical wounds healed faster than I expected, but the emotional ones took more time. At first, she hesitated to go outside alone, flinched when she saw someone walking toward the porch. But every day she fought back, inch by inch. She started planting again, this time with the help of neighborhood kids who had once been strangers. They brought her seeds and painted stones and notes that said things like, "Your garden makes me happy." And one day she laughed, really laughed, at a squirrel stealing one of her strawberries. That sound stayed with me for hours. With her encouragement, I worked on new legislation at the state level, measures to increase transparency and accountability in HOAs, especially in communities where vulnerable residents could be targeted. I testified before the committee, using our story not as a cautionary tale, but as a call to action. The bill passed unanimously. Emily began a project of her own, a community garden open to everyone, accessible to all abilities. She named it Rosie's Patch, after the strawberry plant that somehow survived everything. On opening day, she cut the ribbon herself, surrounded by neighbors who now looked at her, not with pity, but admiration. The girl who had once been treated like a burden had become the heart of the neighborhood, and I had never been prouder. The evening air was soft, touched with the scent of lavender and fresh earth as I stood at the edge of Rosie's Patch, watching Emily laugh with 2 little boys helping her water a new row of daisies. The golden hour sun spilled over her face, catching the joy in her eyes like a reflection of everything she had fought through. She moved with grace now, unafraid, her wheelchair gliding easily over the garden paths she had helped design. It wasn't just a garden. It was a living testament to her resilience, her strength, and her refusal to be diminished. I stood back, hands in my pockets, letting her shine. She didn't need me as a shield anymore. She had found her place, her voice, and her power, but I was still there, always, watching, ready. That's what fathers do. Not just protect, but believe, encourage, and step in only when the world forgets what kindness looks like. I thought back to the first time I pushed her into a hospital room, her tiny body wrapped in blankets, doctors murmuring uncertain words. I remembered every time she fell, every tear she shed, every time she looked up at me for answers I didn't have. And then I remembered the moment she stood up, not on her feet but in courage, facing a woman twice her size with nothing but truth in her heart. Karen had thought she was facing a helpless girl and an absent man. She had no idea she was picking a fight with a daughter who had fire in her soul and a father with justice in his blood. She didn't know I was the deputy commissioner, but that never really mattered. What mattered was this promise I made silently that day in the hospital, and every day since, that no one, ever, would make my daughter feel small, that no one would take away her dignity without answering for it. As the sun dipped below the rooftops and laughter carried on the breeze, I knew the world had changed, not just for us, but for every silent voice that had been waiting to be heard. And I vowed it never would go unheard again.